With only one episode left, A Murder at the End of the World Episode 6 has concluded the Silver Doe storyline and tied up a lot of loose ends in the present day. But we still don't know our killer, and there's a lot of unknowns around several of our remaining characters. So let's break down everything that happened in Episode 6, and then I'll wrap things up with my thoughts and some of my favorite theories. And by the way, I will be hosting a live stream next week after the finale, so if you'd like to be a part of that discussion, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. All right, let's get to it. The episode opens with Darby struggling in the pool, and after taking her sweet time, Lee finally rescues her and she and David take her to safety. The two of them start talking about Andy, saying his treatment will be over in 43 minutes, and Lee says to David, "Be careful, it's still really raw right now," as he heads off to intercept Andy. This line was really messing with me after the episode, and I still don't know what it means. I don't know why she said it's still really raw. It could be something as simple as Andy's emotional state, but I feel like something happened between Lee and Andy between the last episode and this episode that we haven't seen and will likely see in the finale. Darby asks Lee if she's the one who sent Morse code messages to her lamp, and she says it was because the phones aren't safe. Darby's hesitant to trust Lee because of the fake passport and the fact that Lee may have just attempted to lure Darby to her death in the pool. Darby asks if Lee is covering something up for Andy, but Lee begins telling how controlling Andy is over every aspect of Zoomer's life, and Lee had been looking for ways to escape, but figured the only way she could would be to change her identity. We see quite a detailed flashback as Lee recounts her and Andy's relationship and how controlling he is as a husband and how really controlling he is over Zoomer. We learn that Andy's been abusive with Lee in the past, and I'm willing to bet that's also what happened when we first saw Lee in episode 1, where she was cleaning up the broken vase in her room. Lee tells the story of how she planned to attempt and steal the identity of another mother in order to escape their situation with Andy. She recounts how she covered all of her digital tracks so she couldn't be followed, then drove 18 hours non-stop to a friend's cabin in the Canadian wilderness, only to find Andy on the porch waiting for them when they arrived. On their plane ride home, Andy tells Lee that she's free to leave anytime she wants, but Zoomer will be staying with him. Darby and Lee try to understand the purpose of Andy inviting Bill to the retreat, and Darby says so he wanted to know Bill to know his son more deeply. I'm personally not buying that. Andy doesn't seem like the type of guy who's like, "Hey, you're my kid's biological father. Why don't you let's hang out so we can get to know each other better and I can know my son even more." And that just doesn't jive with me. Darby deduces that Lee invited Rohan so they could use him and his boat to get away, and that they were also working with David to get new identities and passage to a new country. They discuss how Andy is definitely twisted, but also not stupid enough to invite Bill to his retreat and then have him killed, leaving the mystery of our killer unsolved for now. Darby says she's been making the big old mistake by focusing on the killer instead of working to understand the victim. There's a sound of someone at the door and the girls start to run but can't get away because their rings have been deactivated. At that moment, Oliver rounds the corner and says David sent him to retrieve the girls and take them back to his room. Darby says she needs to go to Bill's room, and Oliver asks to tag along because he doesn't like sitting in his room not knowing if he's next, which I find hilarious because this dude's just walking around this murder motel with his noise-canceling headphones on late at night, but he's worried about getting killed. Come on, man. In Bill's room, Darby is going through the evidence and says she wishes she could access the doorbell footage, at which point Oliver hands over his hidden phone for her to use. Darby shows them a section of the footage in which Bill's door opens and closes, but we don't see anyone. Darby says someone masterfully edited themselves out and then begins recounting what happened the night he was killed. I don't believe this was a masterful edit at all, but is actually something else entirely, and ultimately tells us who killed Bill. But we'll get to that later in the video. Darby discovers that Bill left a clue for her by marking the final chapter in her book. Darby begins to read it out loud, and we flash back to the night they break into the Silver Doe killer's house. We once again see them dismantling the staircase and finding the wife's remains, and then being confronted by the killer. This time, though, we see the killer off himself, and then Darby searches him and finds that he's a local police officer named Frank Bell. Darby runs to a neighbor's house and uses their phone to call the police and report what had happened. After that, Bill and Darby are back in their motel room discussing things, and Bill's upset that Darby can only talk about the killer, who Bill believes is a piece of garbage that doesn't deserve any of their attention or focus, yet Darby just keeps bringing him up. We again see Darby awake the next morning to find that Bill is gone, but then she turns to the bathroom, seeming fearful of what she might find in there, which is ultimately a note on the mirror that says, "I think this is both too much and not enough. I left you the car." Darby looks over to the bathtub to find a laptop with a Fangs sticker on the outside along with Bill's phone. We cut back to present day where Darby is being confronted by Lee and Oliver as she's breaking down after reading the end of the book. Oliver asks her why she's sad, and she says she never wanted to see all the ways she left him before he left her. Oliver says something stuck out to him and rereads the line that says, "Killer was the result of faulty programming, the same code recycled over and over, just in new bodies." Oliver thinks this means Lu Mei is potentially involved, and Darby also asks about Eva, to which Lee says maybe they've fallen in love after spending so much time together during their treatments, and that maybe they're working together. At this point, they talk about how they need to escape and that the boat, which they just hope is still out there, is only 10 miles from the resort. At this point, we hear screaming in the hallway, and the door cam shows David outside with quite the beat-up face. Lee opens the door to find Todd holding David when Andy appears and says, "There's my wife," and the episode ends. First, I want to discuss the conclusion of the Silver Doe storyline. I'm seeing a lot of dissatisfaction online around this storyline. A lot of people wishing that there was some crazy ending, like the killer would have been Darby's dad or something like that. I think the main purpose of these flashbacks was for the audience to better connect with and understand Bill, and to some degree his relationship with Darby. Of course, we also learn a lot more about Darby and how she became the person that she is today, but I think the main purpose of the flashbacks was that deeper audience connection with Bill, which ultimately gave us all much more of a drive to see justice. Because of the flashbacks, we all now have a deeper connection with Bill, we all love Bill, and we want to see someone take the fall for his murder. So in that case, I think the flashbacks served their purpose. Next, I want to say that I believe we've been shown clear alliances in this episode, and with only one episode remaining, I don't think that's going to change. Of the guests at the retreat, we know that Bill, Rohan, David, and Oliver were all working together to help Lee. Sean didn't really seem to be on either side, but was ultimately helpful to Darby. That leaves us with Lu Mei, Zeba, and Martin. Oliver suspects Lu Mei after the book reading in this episode, but my hope is that none of these three characters play any significant role, since we just have one episode left and they haven't really been central characters up to this point. I just think it would be super lame to bring one of these three characters in and be like, oh, they were a major player in everything that's been going on, you just didn't see it up to this point. My hope is that all the guests will come together and work as one unit to try to combat what's been going on here. And what really is going on? Well, of course we'll get those answers next week, but here's what I think. Oliver pointed out Bill's words in Darby's book that said, "The killer was the result of faulty programming, the same code recycled over and over, just in new bodies." Now, I'm seeing a lot of people online saying, well, there you have it, faulty programming, that means Ray's the killer, AI programming, I don't think so. I think there's much more exciting and interesting possibilities. When we look back to Andy's comments about Bill and Zoomer, he said, "Bill provided the hardware, I provided the software." It's pretty evident to me that Andy is doing some really advanced things with Zoomer. First off, it's surprising to me that Lee doesn't think that Zoomer could be chipped, and that's how Andy found her when she attempted to run away to Canada. But I think the chip in question here is far more advanced than just location tracking. We've been seeing advancements in brain chip tech in recent years, most notably the company Neuralink, which is working on highly advanced chips that can restore motor functions and God knows what else. So taking everything into consideration, I'm putting all of my money on this theory. Andy has a severe God complex, and we've seen him commenting about how the world would collapse if they knew he had a medical condition. He feels that the future of mankind rests on his shoulders, and as we've seen, there's been a lot of conversation about the end times in this show. So whether Andy has a real medical condition or not, I believe he's working to move his consciousness into Zoomer's body in order to extend his life here on Earth and continue his work. At first, I thought this was going to be done through some type of get-out-like procedure, but it's far more likely that Zoomer does have some kind of implant, and Andy has figured out or is working on a way to upload his data or brain into this chip, and that's what's going to be controlling Zoomer's body. Now, I do believe there's a tie into Ray here, but not in the way people have been saying since this show started. I don't think Ray is a sentient AI being that has gone rogue, but is instead aiding Andy in his endeavor to transition into Zoomer's body for the betterment of mankind. This could mean that Ray assisted in Rohan and Sean's death, but I don't believe Ray is doing these things out of self-interest, but instead to serve his creator, Andy. Now, that theory basically only answers the question of how we got to where we're at. There's still the problem of Darby, Lee, and Oliver being trapped in Bill's room, with Andy and Todd at the door with really no way out. They're obviously not about to run out the back door, they're not dressed for that, and the rings have been deactivated, so they're not about to start entering other parts of the resort anyway. This is where things get a bit murky to me because I don't see a very sensible way that everyone just walks away with things as they are right now. I think it's very likely that Andy is going to reveal some information showing that potentially Lee really is the bad guy here, and Andy, while he is a terrible human being, hasn't been the one pulling all the strings or killing everyone. I have this vision of the end of the episode. We see Lee being walked out in handcuffs and everyone's just like, nice knowing you, and they like board their flights back home or whatever. If Andy really is the bad guy here, I just can't think of another way this show wraps up. I mean, he would just have to kill everyone, and I don't think that's going to happen, so. But that is the beauty of shows like this, so I will just sit here as patiently as I can and wait on the finale, and of course read all of your interesting comments and theories as well. So be sure to let me know what you're thinking down in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.